Hello, I hope that you're doing well. Today, for our final project for biology, we will be talking about old growth forests.
Here is an overview of all the topics that we'll cover.
So, first off, adaptations. How have old growth forests been successful evolutionarily? So, before we even get into that, let's give a broader definition of what old growth forests are. So, old growth forests are complex, biodiverse forests that have trees that are at least 150 years old. So, this length of time has allowed them to develop really niche in specific biodiverse ecosystems, including lots of lichen, moss, fungi, in addition to these giant trees like giant sequoias, redwoods, Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, grape pine, Arizona pine, etc. And they're part of the definition also is that they're quote unquote undisturbed by human impact. Really, in the past, there has been a lot of issue with protecting these areas to keep them from loggers and other people trying to use the wood for making things like furniture. They play an important role in carbon storage. As we know, carbon dioxide is stored in the wood of trees, and that's what allows them to take up so much space. One of the other things that characterizes old growth forest is that they lack significant disturbance, which are small scale interactions that cause some destruction to the ecosystem, something like a forest fire, and that leads them to develop into what is known as a climax community, which is a relatively stable form of succession. So, first clicker question: what best describes a climax community? The answer is a community that has reached a steady state. So because these trees have been able to adapt with one another and to their environment, they reached a steady state that leads them to be able to support themselves and also the other plants in their ecosystem and also animals. So some of the specific adaptations that help old growth forests obtain the age that they have are things to help them withstand forest fires. So they have thick insulating bark, which makes it so that when there's fires, it doesn't reach the inner vulnerable parts of the tree. They have long needles that when they burn don't actually touch the meristems, which is where you experience the growth. They have self-pruning branches, which means that instead of having a lot of dead material for a fire to catch onto, they drop it to the ground and that keeps them safe. And they have deep roots to one, obtain nutrients, but also keep them in place in the case of a fire. And also they have adaptations with regards to communication and resource sharing. Suzanne Simard is an ecologist, a tree ecologist, or a dendrologist, and she played a key role in discovering the mycorrhizal fungi that link nearly every tree together. And through these networks, they're able to share things like resources like carbon and water, but also share alarm signals and other information that explain certain events that are happening nearby in order to protect the whole community. So even trees that are not the same species will send information to one another or resources because they know that having these large numbers and this large wealth of resources allows them to live for a long time. So you could say they are the original socialists. Clicker question: which of the following cannot be shared between trees and an old growth forest using mycorrhizal fungal networks? The answer is E, all can be shared. So they're able to send all these things, including information and resources that help them survive by depending on one another.
I will be discussing the phylogenetics of old-growth forests. Before diving into the world of phylogenetics as applied to trees of old-growth forests, we must have a basic understanding of this biological concept as a whole and how it applies to plants. So first, what is the definition of phylogenies? We can define this term as the evolutionary relationship and history between groups of organisms. This can be developed into different organizations to show relationships between organisms on a smaller scale, which we're about to discuss, and those on a much larger scale, as seen in the chart on the right. Now, having understood this, we can get into the phylogenetics of plants. As you may or may not know, plants can be broken down into four main phyla: algae, moss, ferns, and angiosperms. Understanding how these groups are placed, which are in the order I said them in, can allow us to be able to group trees as a whole into their respective group, as well as separating them into respective branches of these said groups. Like I said before, phylogenies can be very simple or very complicated. Having a solid understanding of these principles of phylogenetics can help us understand how we can take simple phylogenetic trees and develop them into extremely complicated ones like the one on the right. This phylogenetic tree is actually an organization of trees commonly found in old-growth forests, as seen in the presence of sequoias in this chart. Let's continue this and apply it to the overall topic of these forests. In order to begin the process of organizing old-growth trees into phylum, we have to ask ourselves one initial question. What do we know? We know, as stated in the previous section of this presentation, a handful of species that are considered to contribute to the population of old-growth forests. Some more that were not mentioned include birch, oak, maple, and so on. As long as they fit into the criteria stated by my classmate, they are good to be considered old growth. Next, we must ask ourselves what these trees have in common, and thus separate them into their respective phyla. Although I said that plants can be separated into 4 main phyla, they can be further broken down into other branches. It should be known that most, if not all, trees do not have algae, moss, or ferns as their most recent common ancestor. Instead, they can be found in the phylum of angiosperms or gymnosperms. The most well-known old-growth trees, such as pine and sequoia, are found in the gymnosperm phyla due to their needle-like leaves as well as their open and exposed seeds, such as pine cones. On the other hand, angiosperms are the phylum of old-growth trees such as maples, oaks, and birches due to their protected seeds and characterized by their broad leaves. Though these characteristics are important, it should be known that there are many more features that go into organizing old-growth trees. Lastly, we can observe and analyze forest populations to separate trees from regular ones and old-growth ones, as done in different islands in the Japanese archipelago. In a study conducted in 2016, a group of scientists found that old-growth forests tend to exhibit over-dispersion behaviors, whereas younger trees tend to grow in clumped groups, both of which they noted as phylogenetic traits. This is my first iClicker question. Which are the following old-growth trees would be considered part of the angiosperm phylum? A. Redwoods, B. Oak, C. Sugar pine. The answer is B. Oak. You can see by the broad leaves. My second one is, which shape is more likely to represent old-growth forest trees? A. Triangles, B. Circles, all of the above, D. None of the above. Take a look at the map I created. The answer is A. Triangles.
So now we will talk about plant reproduction, what this looks like for trees, and why reproduction is important in old-growth forests.
There are 2 overarching ways by which plants reproduce: sexual and asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is a form of reproduction that does not involve the combination of gametes. Plants are able to propagate themselves and create offspring from the parent that they are genetically identical to. Sexual reproduction is a form of reproduction that does involve the fusion of gametes from 2 parents. Plants do this by the exchange of pollen through the male and female reproductive systems. Asexual reproduction in plants consists of fragmentation, budding, and spore formation. Fragmentation is when a plant breaks off or splits, and small fragments that come off develop their own roots and become their own plant. In budding, a bud develops on the parent plant, which can then be removed and planted as its own plant. A spore is an asexual reproductive body that's surrounded by a hard protective cover, and these spores can germinate and grow into new plants. Sexual reproduction occurs in flowering plants through the process of pollination. The flowers contain male sex organs called stamens and female sex organs called pistils.
In order for reproduction to occur, the pollen from the stamens needs to reach the pistils to produce offspring.
So how do trees reproduce? The big way trees reproduce is through pollination. Some trees contain both male and female flowers and need to avoid self-pollination because of this. To do this, trees developed adaptations, which can be the shape or color of the flowers, that will help aid in reducing self-fertilization. The goal is to get the pollen off of one tree and onto another to reproduce and hopefully create some genetic variation among the species. Many trees rely on the wind for pollination. Trees shed pollen in hopes that the wind will blow it over to other trees, and the pollen that is carried away hopefully reaches other trees of the same species that contain the female flowers that can be pollinated. Some trees also use insects and animals to help with pollination. The most common types of pollinators are bees, butterflies, wasps, beetles, bats, and hummingbirds. Now for a clicker question. Why would it not be favorable for trees to self-pollinate or fertilize as their main means of reproduction? The correct answer is B. As discussed before, in order for genetic diversity to occur, it is more favorable for the pollen to travel far distances to other trees of the same species. Reproduction further occurs through seed dispersal. Seed dispersal plays a central and critical role in plant ecology. Once pollination occurs, the seeds that the pollination produces still need to be distributed. There are 5 main mechanisms by which seeds are dispersed: gravity, animals, water, wind, and ballistic. Seeds can fall down to the ground and grow and be planted there. They can be carried away by animals, water, or the wind and be planted in a further location.
Or by ballistic seed dispersal.
Which literally means that the seed will either passively or actively be catapulted from the plant. Now we'll look at specifically old-growth forests. A study was done to better understand the importance of the old trees present in old-growth forests. In this study, researchers specifically looked at the secondary characteristics of old-growth Canadian red spruce trees to understand the characteristics relation to the genetic and reproductive status of those trees. Researchers found that the older populations or old-growth forests may represent superior seed sources, but only if they are also sufficient of size and structure. So their stem density and spatial family structure need to be a certain way in order to avoid the effects of interbreeding and genetic drift that would occur through self-pollination. They concluded that larger and older forests appear to have an important evolutionary role as reservoirs of both genetic diversity and reproductive fitness, and that these older populations of trees may be the ones maintaining the adaptive potential of the tree species present in old-growth forests. So this brings me to my last clicker question. What is the main mechanism by which old-growth forests reproduce? The correct answer here is C. There is no one way that trees or old-growth forests reproduce. They can use both mechanisms of reproduction and will change between the two depending on environmental circumstances.
Do trees talk? They absolutely do. Plants and trees use mycorrhizae to communicate with each other. Mycorrhizae are fungal roots that grow away from the tree and outward, interacting with other trees and parts of the ecosystem to benefit both themselves and others. There are several different types of fungi that allow for this communication. AM fungi, or arbuscular mycorrhizae, are mycorrhizae that primarily function in environments with inorganic soil nitrogen, and the soil has high nitrogen mineralization rates. EM fungi, or ectomycorrhiza, are fungal roots that primarily function in environments with slow nitrogen cycling systems and low nitrogen mineralization rates in the soil. These differences allow for differentiation of species and very calculated choices in terms of communication. Phosphorus also follows the same pattern in differentiation between AM and EM fungi, as well as some other nutrients. This is a diagram that displays generally how trees communicate. Here is a clicker question. In what direction do you hypothesize tree roots would grow? Here is a clicker question. In what direction do you hypothesize tree roots would grow?
The answer is E, A and D. They share materials with each other, but also seek their own water.
Trees also communicate in other manners other than nutrient transfer via fungi. Trees can emit electrical signals when they are cut down, mimicking the sensation of pain. Some studies suggest that they can also detect sounds and grow their roots towards the sounds of running water. Trees also communicate through the use of pheromones being released into the air. The pheromones can warn other trees regarding harmful situations that may be attacking specific types of trees. One specific example is where a tree releases pheromones to bring wasps to the tree in order to devour the leaf-eating worms that are attacking the tree. What is a mother tree? Mother trees are some of the biggest and oldest trees in the forest that provide support for other trees. Mother trees are able to provide support to other trees by delivering sugar, water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients that the trees need to survive. There are several theories to how this process occurs. One theory emphasizes a concentration gradient in which one tree is lacking a nutrient. The gradient enacts the mother tree to deliver the nutrient in order to keep the network and that specific tree strong. The other theory involves electrical signals that result in behavioral responses to ensure that all members' communication system are supported. Generally, the mother tree also senses her kin, and when certain members of the network are damaged or unhealthy, she will enact most of her resources to help that specific tree survive, to make sure that the network as a whole stays strong. The last clicker question that we have is, let's see how far back you remember. What kind of mycorrhizae have low mineralization rates for a variety of nutrients, including nitrogen?
Answer is C, ectomycorrhizae. Make sure that you don't mix this up with arbuscular mycorrhizae.